Hello. My name is Andres Martinez. I run the Fellows program here at New America. And I just wanted to say we're going to now move on to our next panel. And Matt Bai, if you could come up here. Oh, here you are. Matt Bai, as many of you, all of you I'm sure know, writes the Political Times column for the New York Times. He's a frequent contributor to the Times Magazine as well for over a number of years. Matt will be our moderator for the second panel, which we've entitled The Politics of Money and the Money of Politics. And Matt, the podium is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Let me introduce our panelists first, since they're standing awkwardly to the side. And I'm gonna introduce them in the order I have them written down here. Or I'll just go by the seating. It's even easier. Mary Jo Pitzel is covers the legislature, politics, and state government for the Arizona Republic, the largest daily newspaper in Arizona. Obviously, one of the largest in the country, right? One of the 5 or 6 largest. Yeah, now it's probably the second or third. Mary Jo is active with the First Amendment Coalition of Arizona, as well as the Best of the West, a journalism contest that benefits First Amendment causes. Fantastic. Welcome. It's nice to meet you. Peter Beinart's name is excellent, but Peter's got like a million things going on. I don't know how to describe them. He's a senior fellow here at New America, is an associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, 2 very dubious professions. He's a senior political writer for the Daily Beast, contributor to Time Magazine, which does still exist, and as opposed to its competitor, and most recently the author of The Icarus Syndrome, A History of American Hubris, which I'd highly recommend. And finally, Dennis Hoffman is here. Dennis is a professor of economics at Arizona State University. Somebody who knows something is actually here. He's published numerous academic articles, books on macroeconomics and econometrics. He's the director of the L.W. Simon Research Institute of the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. And I'm going to launch into it with questions. Let me just say, I sit on a lot of panels, and I hate when moderators talk. So now that it's my turn, I'm going to just take 1 minute, which is to set up the panel, not just for Arizona, but in a national way. When I first started covering national politics, which was in the late 90s, and traveling around, it was a really great time to run a state. And, whether your name was Jesse the Body Ventura, or you were a doctor like Howard Dean, or a name like George W. Bush, whether you had any experience at all, it was you could come in and you could raise revenues you could cut taxes, raise revenues, increase investment in education, all at the same time. I used to say, basically a monkey could govern a state when money was kind of pouring in, and no disrespect to primates, and who I'm sure could govern just fine. But of course, now we see a different reality. On the other end of the spectrum, which is that everywhere you go in the country now, the question is about resources, how you get them, how you allocate them, and what gets cut and what gets kept. And it's very, very painful. And even the most talented and most experienced politicians find themselves in a very difficult situation. And so I think Arizona, from what I read and understand, and I want to ask Dennis about this to start, Arizona, like so many other states in the country, is having these budget issues. I understand you're looking at, what, a $2 billion projected budget deficit? What's the...
We'll get there. You can define it however you want to define it.
But on a percentage basis, because these numbers never mean anything. You say to people $2 billion. But I think you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% of your state budget in deficit.
Huge. It's huge.
Tell us why. I mean, I know that's an hour-long presentation, but tell us what's going on with Arizona's budget and economy. Oh, we have slides.
Great. We do have slides. Is this essentially what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about economics in the state, attitudes in the state, and then spend most of my time literally on a slide that goes right to the heart of your question. So if that's
take it away,
if that's all right. So there are. For those of you that have died, during PowerPoint presentations, I will just warn you, there's only 12 slides. We're going to go through many of them very quickly and then simply get right back to the fundamental question with the last slide. So if I could get some responsiveness here. There we go. Okay. This is a horribly tedious slide when you first see it. Nobody could learn anything from something like this, but actually the more that I was staring at it, the more intrigued by it I got. This is nothing more than starting at point in time. Across the horizontal axis are simply months. This just simply starts at the peak of the business cycle prior to all of the post-war recessions. That's what the colors are. You've seen this probably in numerous places. I saw it just yesterday in national media. This is the duration in time it takes you to get back to peak employment. This is part of the problem that we're facing here today. This was the 2001 recession. Actually, it wasn't anywhere near the deepest recession that we have suffered in the post-war period, but it took us the longest to get back to the prior peak. Okay? Guess what that one is? That one's 91. Okay? We are increasingly slow at rehiring people. This is where we are today nationally. We are just barely off the bottom. There's a couple lines here to distinguish whether or not we're going to count census workers. So this is what the nation is facing. When are we going to get back to the peak? Of course, the politicians are hoping that it happens very soon. This is the same graph for Arizona historically. And what I want you to be thinking about is, hey, we're Arizona. We don't have recessions. This is all of the recessions in Arizona through 2001. We have these minor falls, and we're back to peak within 2 years. Okay, we had a real estate downturn here in '91. We don't do recessions in Arizona until now. So this is what Arizonans are seeing in comparison to this. This is what we're dealing with now. We've lost 10% from the peak, and there is no rapid trajectory that gets us back with any policy, with any particular issue. So I want to dig into kind of not just why this happened to us. Everybody says it was
Let me stop you for 1 second.
Yeah.
So are you saying that in terms of state finances, are you saying that the issue is lost revenue due to unemployment? Are you seeing
that's
where
we're gonna go into psychology around spending, and then we're going to go right to your budget question. So what I'm saying is that this effect has certainly had a huge impact on psychology in the state. Okay, we've depended historically, had the luxury, and Dr. Kaur talked about this earlier. We just kind of sit back and wait for the folks to arrive. This is net domestic in-migration. They slowed a little bit when Barron's wrote the article, Boomtown Goes Bust. I only have these through 2008. A lot of people are suggesting that the 9 numbers are at or below 0, and 10 may be the same. So the folks aren't coming. Historically, the revenue model is people show up, they buy a house, we get taxes. They buy a car, we get taxes. They buy furniture, we get taxes. And then the next year we don't ask them for much, but that's okay. The next crowd shows up and we get taxes. Okay, we're fine. Way too tedious. All I want to do is to show you, this is housing prices. And this is, the bar on the left by month is back to 2001, and the bar on the right is 2010. So what this tells me, in September of 2010, the average housing sale price is now below where it was in 2001. So we doubled our housing prices and now given it all back. Consumer confidence is completely shattered as a result. So we have consumer confidence numbers that fall absolutely dramatically. Some of us are a little giddy over a little ramp that we've had recently. Well, it's got to go up at some point, right? It's got to go up before things turn. All right. I want to focus on these 3 slides because they go right into the revenue issue. Think about this. I took the dollar volume of spending on automobiles and divided it by income. That's all it is. So what does this say? This says historically, from 1989 through 2007, this was the easiest thing in the world to predict. I'm a revenue forecaster. It was easy. 6% of people's incomes gets allocated to automobiles. It just happens. This is very important for revenue. We fund schools on sales taxes from auto purchases. So this is 2006. People talk about a real estate bubble. I don't see any real estate bubble here. We spent 6% on automobiles forever. We're spending less than 3 today. The dollar spent on automobiles in Arizona is about the same as the nominal dollar spend in 89. 99. No, 89. What am I? 99, I'm sorry. 99. Construction. Now there we do see a little bit of real estate bubble. But 6 to 8% is pretty much the norm to spend on housing. Today it's less than 4. The rest of retail, this is furniture, fixtures, what you buy at Lowe's, any taxable retail. Okay? People are not spending. What's a long run? Well, this trend down is the shift of more and more income dollars are devoted to services, which are non-taxed. But still, we're short here. If you aggregate all 3 of these last slides, we're missing about $15 billion in taxable transactions that could be taking place in the state of Arizona. Okay? And this is what's killing us. This is slide 11, by the way. I'm almost there. Ongoing revenues are fueled by sales taxes and income taxes, corporate and individual. Ongoing expenditures in our general fund, K-12, indigent health care, prisons and public safety, and higher ed, and then a bunch of others. And this is, by the way, in order of spent. We spend the most on K-12, second on access. We spent nothing on this, by the way, in the early 80s. This is a new program for Arizonans. Now prisons and public safety, we spend more on prisons than we do on universities in Arizona. It's easier to get into the prisons. So, and my final slide, we'll spend the rest of the time here, because if I could get people to think in the state of Arizona about this particular slide, I think it would answer a tremendous amount of issues around the state. So all we do is we take the total ongoing revenues. This isn't gimmick revenues. This is not money we got by selling buildings. This is not federal
tobacco
stimulus.
settlement.
No. These are dollars that we've asked the taxpayers to contribute to pay for K-12 universities, prisons, that kind of thing. Ongoing revenues, ongoing expenditures. There's a couple of fundamental characteristics I want you to see. And we can take the revenues back to 71 and probably piece together the expenditures. What you saw for years and years and years is that the budgeting problem in Arizona is kind of like the issue that you talked about. It was really automatic. We asked the folks for 5% of their incomes, $50 out of every 1,000 earned. So this could be 5% or $50 out of every 1,000 earned. Same thing. We asked them for 5% of their incomes, and this came, by the way, from businesses, from individuals. But we just took the revenue and divided it by personal income, 5%. And we funded government about at that level forever, until the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, we made a concerted change in our budgeting policy, in our taxing policy. The rhetoric of the mid-90s was, we have to eliminate the individual income tax in Arizona. So individual income tax rates, you have to understand this, today in Arizona are 40% below where they were in 1995. And the story was, we need to eliminate our individual income tax. It will bring on permanent prosperity in the state of Arizona. So what we did is we eliminated...
Dennis, let me ask you,
Yeah.
I do want to move it just so I can get to other
Yes.
panelists as well. I'd like to open to questions at the end too. So,
Yes. 1 minute then.
Okay.
So what we've done since then is spent less and taxed less. People in our state will say that our current budget problem, which is manifested on this graph, of the difference between these two lines. When you said, what's the budget deficit? It's the difference between these two lines as a share of personal income. That would be about $2 billion on this particular scale. That would be, that's that particular difference right there. We made that up in 2010 by selling buildings and federal stimulus money. Going forward, we can't sell the buildings again. We won't get more stimulus. But the deficit is being blamed on this particular ramp that took place here during the real estate boom. The egregious spending trajectory that was pointed. Every time this line goes up, that means we are spending and taxing faster than the economy is growing. But what we've seen is that that particular spending level historically was actually below the long-run norm. This is what the folks are contributing now. This is what the planned expenditure is. It simply shows that we have a massive structural problem in the state, but by historical standards, it's simply, in some sense, simply the result of the fact that folks are now contributing 30% per thousand, not $30 per thousand, not $50 per thousand. I can go back to this. Just leave.
That's great. That's
the only thing I'm going to refer to again.
Thank you. That is that is compelling. Peter, let me go to you. Which is, I mean, look. So what Dennis is telling us is basically like you're not creating enough revenue. Is what it all kind of boils down to. And you and I were talking before. I mean, this every time I go to Arizona, I look. It's like something. It's like being in. I feel like it's being in Boston or New York at the turn of the last century. This is the new America. Things were always sprouting out of the ground throughout the 90s. You come back, there's another building, there's another road. This is the boom town. How can it be declining? I mean, the supply siders tell us you should be cutting revenue and getting more money because you should be growing economically if you're cutting your tax base. What's going on in the new America?
Well, I'm not an expert on Arizona, of course. I mean, seeing these really compelling slides just deepens my sense that we're dealing with some of the dynamics that we experienced in the early 1990s. I would say from the kind of the end of the Cold War until the middle of the 90s when America really started booming. And it was a very convulsive time politically. You think about the kind of the collapse of the Reagan coalition, the rise of Ross Perot as a very serious third-party candidate, the Gingrich revolution. And I think underlying a lot of that moment was, which we forgot because it got buried by the prosperity and triumphalism of the second half of the 90s, which essentially transferred into the Bush administration, was the sense in that period, in the early 90s, that the country was in decline, that our best days were behind us, which created a kind of a particularly convulsive and I think nasty and unpredictable politics. And it seems to me, I mean, what these kind of slides suggest to me is that we are economically in that early 90s period on steroids, plus. I mean, this is just fundamentally much bigger economic situation we're facing, and I think that perhaps that's the case politically too. I mean, I think that maybe that we had this very, very convulsive, unpredictable time, and then things kind of stabilized, I would argue, essentially because of the 90s boom, but we could be in for a much longer period like that. And I think that there is this sense, I think, that underlying a lot of the nastiness of American political debate today is this sense that the country will never recover, that we will never get back to the America that we imagined we were living in, and that our best days are kind of behind us, and that each side blames the other for that. And I think it's particularly, I'm just listening to the last panel, I think it's particularly significant that when Americans think about what it means to be in decline and what it means to lose the America that we remember or that we think we remember, a lot of it has to do, I think, with the sense that things in our lives are no longer under our own control. Because I think that what we don't often think enough about is that this post-war moment that we always kind of tend to refer back to The left is the economic golden age when wages rose for working class people. The left is the kind of cultural golden age before the 1960s. It was in a moment when America was simply much less interconnected with the rest of the world. I mean, we had not much immigration basically between when we cut it off in the 20s and when we started it again in the 60s. America's economic role was much less integrated. It was much more self-sufficient. And then in the 90s we had this rise of this globalization rhetoric. But it was not what we're facing now. Globalization was really, what do we do to the rest of the world? How do we export everything American? That's why they called it Americanization outside the rest of the world. And now globalization has become essentially what the world does to us, how the world changes us. And I think in that way, I think Walter Russell Mead has written really well about this. I think one of the things we really need to do is start to remember what American political and cultural and economic debates were like in an earlier period, 100 years ago, even in the late 19th century, when in fact America didn't have this sense of, was in some ways much more buffeted by things that took place over, beyond our shores, and in which we were in the midst of massive immigration, and that might help to help us understand some of the moment that we're in. But I think it's likely to be a very difficult and ugly moment, as long as America has had, by some counts, 5 or 6 kind of decline panics since World War II. It's not like this is the first one. We've had a lot of them. They tend to come once a decade or so, roughly. But that's not that comforting to me, because it seems to me that if the economy is, if these statistics are right, this decline panic is likely to be much more sustained and severe than those other ones. They'll look like blips in comparison.
Particularly since the periods of growth have been largely reliant on ephemeral sectors of the society, right? Paper. So in the period you referenced in the early 90s, that led to a political moment where there was a lot of exasperation with the two parties and with the system as it was, a lot of sort of anti-party rebellions, and a great obsession of the parties with independent voters, right? And a move away that continues from party affiliation. So Mary Jo, what are you seeing in the effects and the political process that you cover when you see a budget situation like this, when you see the tensions in immigration we heard about in the last panel? What becomes the culture of governance? What becomes the way that the politicians you cover deal with each other on a party level and on a personal level, and are they able to get anything done?
Well, in Arizona, the legislature is controlled by Republicans in both the House and Senate. They have pretty secure majorities, and that's not going to change after next month's election. What I've seen in the 4 years that I've been out there, I came out at the end of the boom, and just as things were starting to turn down. When I came out to the legislature, they were fighting over what to do with $1 billion surplus. And you can fight a long time. And they had a very long session trying to decide how to divvy up that money. Within 3 years, they were looking at $1 billion deficit and fighting. It's become...
so they didn't decide to just put it away for a rainy day,
I guess. Oh, my goodness. No, we did tax cuts.
Yeah.
We did tax cuts, and we expanded programs. And then the floor fell out. And the programs are going away. The tax cuts are still in place. That also helps to contribute to that gap in the lines that Dennis showed. Right. The legislature's response to that pretty much has been a sense of panic, and I contend with one notable exception, increased polarization. We had when Governor Napolitano left to join the Obama administration, and Jan Brewer ascended to become governor in early '09, we had a whole new crop of lawmakers who had just been elected. They brought them in. They did a special session on the budget. I can't remember now how many millions they cut out of the budget within 2 weeks of these folks having been sworn into office. They didn't know what they were doing. They were being led by the hand by their leaders, and this was an opportune moment to cut government. And you had to cut. They had to do something. The budget has to balance, and the quickest thing to do is to cut programs, because it fits with the belief of many people that government's bloated, and also because, as has been noted earlier, it's pretty darn impossible to raise taxes. So, and that's continued. That continued throughout '09 and into 2010. Just pretty much the Democrats have been irrelevant to this. The Republicans have controlled it. The one moment of unity was
was when they actually referred a sales tax increase to the ballot, and Arizona in May became the only state in which voters themselves said, yes, tax us. We're showing up. It was a 65% vote in favor, 66% vote in favor of a temporary tax increase, but nonetheless a tax increase. And that tax increase, very oddly, was championed by our new Republican governor, Jan Brewer, who said, there's just no way. There's no way to make this work. She fought for a year with her Republican colleagues in the legislature who resisted this with every tactic that they could consider, including literally holding the budget hostage. I went and found the room where they had the budget bills, which they refused to transmit to the governor. They were being held hostage. She had to sue them to try to shake those things loose. It was a horrible, terrible battle. It went on for a year. Finally, we got a coalition of Democrats and Republicans who sort of broke from their staunch lines and voted to refer a tax to the voters. They weren't even voting necessarily. Some of them said, I'm going to send this to the ballot. I'm going to be a big no vote, but we've got to do something. That was the one moment where you had some level of thaw in the polarization.
Well, now tell me, Mary Jo, what's the and Dennis, having worked on this issue, may have something to say about this too, but what's the generational difference here and connection to this? And we think of, those of us outside Arizona, think of old-time Arizona politics as Barry Goldwater, right, who by today's standards seems, almost moderate, right? He told conservative Republicans in 1960 to get over it, right, to support moderates. He did bipartisan stuff later in his career and sort of softened on social issues. I mean, this generation of conservatives, these Republicans who have the majorities in Arizona, are they kindred to the generation that came before, or is there a different mentality that infuses the politics and government of the state?
Oh, it's very much the latter. The Republicans in Arizona today are not, by and large, those that are in elected office in the state are not of the Barry Goldwater mold, and that ties in somewhat to another theme of this panel, which is Arizona's public finance system, which we can talk about a little bit more.
Well, tell us about it if you.
Arizona is one of, I don't know, like 2 or 3 states that has public campaign finance, which means, hey, isn't that nice? You don't have to go out, you don't have to shake down mostly business types in the local chamber of commerce to support your campaign. The state will provide funds for you. This comes from a surtax on court fines as well as voluntary contributions from voters. So there's this pool of money. It was created by voters. It's called clean elections. So that's got a very nice ring to it, meaning that anybody who runs with traditional financing is running dirty.
Now, these are only matching funds? I'm a little confused about this. Yeah. Or do you get funds in addition and then matching funds?
You get funds, right. Everybody gets money to start with. If you decide to run under public financing, you get a certain level of money depending on which office you are seeking. And then if you have an opponent who is running with traditional outside contributions, they raise more money than you're getting from the public fund. The public fund will match you. So this, again, the idea of this is to create a level playing field and to ostensibly to reduce the influence of outside forces on campaigns. What that's done, people like to say this is a big ha-ha moment because it was believed, I guess, widely in many circles that the point of the clean elections system was to try to bring more moderates to governance. What it did is it brought people from the edges because they don't need to cozy up to the business types who are the primary funders traditionally of campaigns. That's given us a whole breed of majority Republicans who aren't beholden to the business crowd, which does not like what's happening with the immigration legislation in Arizona. That's hew much more strongly to a social agenda. Thus, you'll see things such as we had the gay marriage debate that we had a couple of years ago, other strong social issues. That's brought. That's why the Republicans of today are different than those of. That's one of the major contributors to why they're different than those of the Goldwater era. There's also things like national mood, of course, that influence that as well.
So the dispiriting thing, what we're hearing, we heard on the last panel, it struck me this, the disaffection of the voters in the polling that was showed. And Peter, this is a state that has shown remarkably reformist appeal, right? It produced John McCain, who in the early part of this decade was, considered probably the strongest voice for reform of the political process. It had redistricting reform this decade. It had a clean election law passed in the late 1990s. And nothing I'm hearing on either of these panels suggests that anything's gotten a damn bit better. So, in fact, quite the opposite. Should we stop trying to reform the political process?
Well, I mean, this is, this does go to the old, there is the old argument which is often made against these kind of things, which is about unintended consequences, which is to say, it's the old conservative saw that basically rational planners who try to come up with schemes to socially engineer the way that politics is gonna play themselves out actually end up often producing the opposite, and that's a very old conservative theme, and there's some wisdom to it. But I also think, at least in the campaign finance part, and we can see on the national level, there's also the story of a very powerful concerted group that has basically been hostile to campaign finance and has had a lot of success, now through the courts and in other ways in undermining the whole idea. I think that my suspicion is that that we'll go back and forth in this cycle. That basically that the result of Citizens United and other things like that will be eventually, in some form or another, maybe not in the next couple of years at the national level, because the Republicans will have a lot of power, but sooner or later, some new wave of trying to control money in politics in some way. I think that it's just
shouldn't the internet do that? Shouldn't the ability to reach out and get small dollar contributions in the way that the president did during his campaign reform the process in and of itself?
Well, I mean, it's. I think that's a healthy thing if you have lots of small donors, but that doesn't answer other questions like you can still have a lot of influence with large relatively anonymous donors,
yeah.
And so I think eventually you're going to have some seat, probably won't be led by John McCain, but some new effort at kind of dealing. It's an old progressive impulse, which is deep roots, is to kind of clean up politics and to find ways of getting special interest out of it and putting the public interest ahead of special interest. And I think that's a language that's very, very ingrained in our political system, and I think it'll return, but I think it'll have to. But as in this last effort, we may see that ultimately doesn't actually work as much as people would have hoped.
Right. Bill Bradley used to say, right, that the money's like ants in the kitchen; it just always finds its way through. He has a way of putting things. So Dennis, I'm going to wave a magic wand and say you're now going to be in charge. Forget the legislature. Martial law is declared, and you can fix the budgeting process and the political atmosphere around it. What needs to be done? What would you implement? Would you just raise taxes? Is it that simple?
No,
would you raise revenue?
No, it's not. It's not that simple. I actually think that there's a logical. I just don't know the political strategy here. There's a logical fix to this. I think that all of the rhetoric in the state, and I don't think we're that unusual in this regard. I think a lot of rhetoric across the nation, federal level or other states, it's all around the issue of taxation. People feel overtaxed. You poll people, they feel like they're overtaxed. If you poll Arizonans, they're going to tell you they're overtaxed. What's happened to my taxes in the last 15 years? Am I paying more or less? They're going to tell you they're paying more. And I mean, this data is just stunning. They're paying, considerably less. But the disconnect, I think, is we never really figure out exactly what folks want from government. We hear that they want to support K-12, but they don't really, how much do they want to support K-12? What do they really want out of government? I guess this kind of the closest. This is kind of the closest thing to pay-go, I guess, is when I hear about it. But we don't as policymakers. I don't think our policymakers work hard enough to truly understand what folks want from government, what they value, what it's going to cost. Honestly, after we.
But they want everything, don't they?
No, well. I just think it's a confusion. In Arizona, they want a lot of stuff. They want $40 or $45 per thousand. Really, is what they want on the spend, but they don't want to pay for it.
And I'm yet to meet the voter in all my travels who says, "I really want good education, but not enough, not as much as I want retirement money. So let's just leave that on the back burner." Right? I mean, they want everything all at once. So where's the civic education component of this? Why isn't anyone telling the voters that there are actually choices to be made?
This is where I'm going, though. I think that they need to hear that there are choices, and this is why I think our Prop 100 in May was successful. By the way, but we actually had
because it forced a choice.
We had 2 budgets passed. It wasn't. It was clear. If you passed the sales tax increment, you're going to get this budget. If you didn't, you're going to get this budget, and you could literally see what you're going to have to live without.
Cool.
Now, what we didn't do, well, I was afraid that they didn't really translate. They knew it was going to be less K-12, but they didn't know what that meant. You know, I would have just as soon heard that, well, it's going to be,
50 kids.
It'll be higher kids in a classroom, or we're going to do without sports, or we're going to do without extracurriculars. By the way, the sales tax, I wanted to get to this. It'll give us about $4 a thousand. So it'll give us about $4. So it'll help for 3 years, and then it goes away.
Right.
Okay. So we still have cutting to do, but going right back to your question, find out how much folks want from government, and then have the courage to just simply ask them for the revenue, for God's sake.
And
there's this mystery around, people are timid about asking people to pay for the public services they apparently want.
They like to win elections. But this sales tax issue you raise is really interesting because 3 years from now it's going to go away. We're facing this on the federal level, right? In Arizona, is the responsible thing to tell the voters this can't really go away because you don't have the revenue to balance the things you want, or is the responsible thing to make sure it goes away so that voters keep faith in the idea that when politicians tell them something is temporary, they actually mean it?
I think you just have to lay it out, and when we come to that decision, when it goes away, you just simply have to remind them, okay, now it's going to go away, and it's buying you this right now, and next year you're going to live without this. Make your choice.
Right. Now, one thing we haven't talked about in either of these panels is the media, which I don't want to be egocentric about it, but everywhere you go, you hear governors talking about the effects of dwindling media. Mary Jo, what's happening in Arizona? What's happening in the media environment, and is there enough coverage still, enough scrutiny of government to keep people as engaged and informed as we would ultimately want them to be?
Well, Arizona is primarily an urban state. I work out at our state capital. There's a bureau out there. And the Arizona Republic's the only statewide newspaper with a presence out there. The Tucson paper, the Arizona Daily Star, pulled their reporter earlier this year. The Associated Press is out there. A couple radio stations and an online news service. And
in Washington, it's probably less, right?
Washington, we've got like a half person from Gannett News Service who's devoted to other things. So no, there's not enough scrutiny. I will say, big plug for my employers, but they love the state budget story. They've actually increased our numbers out at the state capitol in terms of manpower, which is amazing in this time of journalistic decline in terms of the industry. But yeah, overall, I don't think there's enough attention to it. It rarely gets onto television, and internet. There's one I think very good online news service, but it's subscription only, has a limited reach.
And so let me ask Peter about this this issue. I mean, because you do hear this everywhere you go, here on the Hill, in Congress and the Senate. If you go out to the states and talk to governors, they all say, I can't reach people. I can't, I used to have 12 State House reporters. Now I have 2, and, I can't, I feel like when we do something, nobody knows about it. Is that just a lot of whining, or do you think that's having an impact nationally on the way we deal with these issues?
It's interesting. Well, I think we're probably going to have a good case study in the next few years, because, I do think nationally we're going to have to confront exactly the kind of trade-offs that it seems to me Arizona actually did a pretty good job of confronting with its population. And I think there's going to be a huge need for some politicians, I think, simply be willing to put their careers at risk. I think that was partly the lesson of the early 90s. I mean, you had two presidents. You had Bush who raised taxes and signed a difficult budget, and basically that was part of the reason he lost re-election. And then Clinton went ahead and also did a tough budget and raised re-elections and suffered the political consequences. So I think it's partly going to be it's a question of whether you can communicate or not, whether you have politicians who are basically simply willing to put their political futures on the line to do hard stuff that everybody knows it. But it's also about whether those politicians can foster a healthy debate. I mean, my hope is that at some point the various mantras that we have, can't sacrifice anything in the war on terror, certainly can't raise taxes, certainly couldn't cut healthcare costs in a more meaningful way. Eventually, the people will be forced to grapple with the impossible intersection of this. But I think it's really, I have to say, it's humbling to me as an American to see what's happening in Great Britain, where a prime minister seems to be able to come in and say, look, we're going to cut everything. And I think it's partly because he's cutting everything that he's going to be able to do it, because he is raising taxes and he's cutting defense spending, as well as truly brutal cuts to the things that the labor unions and other places. And I think the question is, who is going to me, and Goldwater was the kind of person who would have done this. I mean, this was at a moment in which to be a right-wing conservative meant that the most important thing you were concerned about was deficits that would lead to inflation. That was even more important to you than cutting taxes or fighting the communists. It was absolutely number one, not only for Goldwater but for Eisenhower. And I think the question for me is, who comes out of this Tea Party, Republican Party, who's willing to start saying those things, who's a little more Goldwater-esque and Cameron-esque, or even Ron Paul-esque, because Paul, unlike a lot of other people, is actually willing to talk about spending in terms of the military, which I think is going to have to be a big part of the conversation, which has implications for Afghanistan. And so I think that there's going to be a real moment of statesmanship for somebody who can come out of this new rising Republican Party who's going to be able to say those things, and I hope somebody does.
And Mary Jo, is the Tea Party influence in Arizona, where they've always had a very strong libertarian grassroots current, is it transformational in the political culture there, or is it just a manifestation of a strain that's been with you for a long time?
I think it's more the latter. I think the Tea Party sort of is a lot of Arizona's, you see it in the Republican Party. You see it playing out this cycle a little more on the congressional level. On the state level, we really don't have. The few candidates who ran for the state house and called themselves Tea Party members didn't get out of their Republican primaries. It's because they're going up against people who really are sort of already there with a lot of this less spending, cut spending mantra.
And the friction, I mean, it was interesting to hear in an earlier panel that voters are actually younger than a lot of us think in Arizona. But the friction that is evident in this state between, Dennis, between Latino populations and white populations, immigrant populations and long-standing populations, between old retirees and younger voters. I mean, there are real fracture points in the electorate here. Is that more important than party distinctions at this point? Is that the new ideology of Arizona? Is it ethnic? Is it generational?
Well, okay. I'm neither a political scientist nor a sociologist, so the extent to which those issues are important, or I just don't know. But what I do know is there is a dramatic, over the last couple of years, and economic historians are going to look at this very carefully, because we were struggling at the end of 07, let's say. Things weren't looking great. We knew there was going to be a soft patch coming in the economy. We then passed and validated one of the toughest employer sanctions laws on undocumented labor. And it was ironic to me, and I always thought about this, that we passed this legislation kind of oblivious to the fact that if there was any state in the union that had leveraged undocumented labor better than Arizona, I just don't know. I mean, these folks built most of the state, and but yet we passed that legislation. And since then, most of the time we've led the nation in job losses. The extent to which our problems, stem from these kinds of issues, I don't know. Economic historians are going to be dabbling in I can see there's going to be dozens of PhD theses.
But you're saying the connection between cutting down on illegal immigration and improving your economic fortunes appears to be quite different in Arizona from what people expect it to be.
Oh, I just think I think that that's the case. But where I was going with this is confidence is completely shattered in the state at levels I just would have thought historically would be unthinkable. And I attribute that to massive wealth loss, maybe some of the social tension that you're talking about. You know, we're going to find out how much out-migration we've had. We don't really know. But the statistic that dazzles me, and I'm surprised it doesn't get more play. You know, we lead the nation in job losses for a couple of years. Just, you know, we're ahead of Detroit in job losses. Yet if you look at our unemployment rate, we're slightly better, slightly lower than the national average. There's only one way you can get there. That's arithmetic. A lot of our unemployed have left.
Right.
That's the only way you can get there.
And I want to open up to questions before I do. Mary Jo, is there a leader on the horizon? Who is the strongest political leader right now in Arizona? Who is the person making the most sense of this? Is there anybody who is galvanizing any hope in either party?
I don't see a strong voice making sense of this. I would say that right now the most recognizable leaders in the state are Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County, and Senator Russell Pierce, and that all revolves around the immigration question. Pierce is possibly going to be the next Senate president in Arizona. We don't know. We won't know that until after the election and a closed door vote. But and if he becomes Senate president, then that just elevates his profile. Senate president is, I mean, it's nominally an important job. I mean, they basically assign people to committees, but you can make all kinds of important determinations, including who sits on that independent redistricting panel that Rudy Espino was talking about earlier. So at least at first blush, you ask me who's the next generation up and comer, who's on the bench, you know, I'm looking for ideas.
That's depressing.
I got to engage because I'm sitting here and I remembered something Dr. Kaur said and it really kind of resonated with me. We felt nearly this bad in 90 and 91. And we mustered up the courage to fix our fiscal situation. We actually did some budget cuts, and we raised taxes. Actually, we raised, not just by a vote of the people, the legislature actually mustered up the courage to do it in 1991. This was shortly after Barron said it will never rise again. Confidence was shattered. Everybody, was leaving the state. Domestic net immigration was way off. But if you had invested in our state in 91 and 92, you were a very happy camper 5 and 10 years later. And so the real lesson for history for us is, are we down for the count or will history repeat? And, that's the jury's out on that. But I think it's really an interesting historical parallel for us.
Are you trying to get us to buy bonds?
Yeah, buy one of our state buildings.
You might be happy.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I thought since all of you are listening so politely out there, if there are questions for the panel, we'll take them. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Mark Schmidt with American Prospect in America.
Mark. Hi. Can't see with the lights.
I know. I've been in your position. Actually, one reason I came up here for the latter part of this whole event was because I've always been interested in, written a lot about the Arizona campaign finance law, and I kind of suspected that I was hoping I'd hear the argument kind of fleshed out a little bit, that's kind of the source of the trouble. I mean, when I've looked at it, it's, it seemed to me that most of the Republicans have not been participants in the clean election system. And most of those elected under the system have actually been Democrats or more moderate, a lot of Latinos. I'm just wondering if you can sort of just expand a little bit. Are there particular legislators who wouldn't be there otherwise? Or, is there a paper that somebody should read? I feel like when I dig into this claim, I'm not quite seeing it there. So I'm just asking.
The specific claim, Mark, that it's not changed anything.
Well, no, I'm not saying that it hasn't changed anything. That the biggest change that it's created is that it's caused these far more radical Republicans to be elected. I mean, you point out they're certainly not in the Goldwater mold, but then the Republican legislators in 1990 weren't in the Goldwater mold either. I mean, the state Republican Party went pretty far to the right quite some time before the campaign finance law was passed. Tell me why I'm wrong about that.
Well, no, you're not totally wrong, but the folks that come to mind, there was an effort at making some changes to the campaign finance law this year, and the resistance in the Republican caucus in the House came from a handful of Republicans on the conservative side who have used this system to be elected. They didn't want to buy off on any changes to it because it's worked for them. Representative Steve Montenegro, who is the only Latino Republican in Arizona's legislature, is running for a second term now, again using public campaign finance. He's in a tight spot. He actually has a Democratic opponent who's raised a lot of private money without the matching funds. She's got a lot more money to reach people, and we might see an upset there. But he got elected using the public finance, banded together. Representative Carl Seal, you can argue that perhaps he's there because of clean elections. I actually argue it's because he had a very flawed opponent in 2008, and once that guy sort of fell off the radar screen, it was an easy go. But these folks are coming back in, running with the public campaign finance. So that's where I look at a block of Republicans in both the House and Senate caucuses. And without clean elections, I don't know if they could go out and raise enough money in a traditional sense. Even Russell Pierce in 2008 used the public campaign finance system because he anticipated correctly a strong challenge from within his own party, and he used that public money to withstand that challenge.
It may be right that the public, I mean, from what Mark's describing in the earlier part of the decade and what you're describing, it may be right that the public finance laws favor or will have the most impact on whoever feels marginalized, wherever the grassroots energy is at, right? Because that's where you feel like, just like the internet, that's where a person gets the idea that I can be the change agent, I can go out and I can get people in the community to support me, and I can get enough money from the clean election law, right?
I didn't respond before because Mary Jo articulated it very well. I have had members of the Greater Phoenix leadership. Now, this is the outfit that used to be called the Phoenix 40. And so this is the smoke-filled room business
the
decisions.
Yes.
I've had them tell me. In fact, the one gentleman I really respect said, when clean elections got passed, I thought maybe that's a good idea. It's the grassroots and et cetera, et cetera. He said, but you know what? Nobody ever asks my opinion anymore. They don't care what we think. They don't care. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the smoke-filled rooms decisions in the 80s, they were pretty good. Bring them back as far as I'm concerned. These guys made some pretty good calls. They supported freeway.
You did have a minor problem with corruption in the 1980s and 90s, did you not? A couple of you
guys
governors went to jail, as I recall.
I want to say we got freeways. We got a nuclear power plant. We got our legislative team was effective in bringing Central Arizona Project water. We kind of got it done before. There's probably some issues like everywhere, but we got some things done.
Now that is a provocative argument.
But can I just add one thing to that? Another thing that we've seen is that candidates who get elected using the public campaign finance, often then when they seek re-election, they've been established, they've had their 2 years to get established, they'll go out, many of them, and will run with traditional financing. So they are in a position where they're going to have to, ask people or ostensibly listen to what folks are telling them.
That makes sense. But, by the way, Dennis, I was recently in Providence, right, which is like the only northeastern industrial city that's now booming, and I was looking out over the beautiful water vista and thinking, corruption, had the most corrupt mayor in the country. I don't see Hartford, I don't see Worcester jumping out of the ashes. Anyway, yes, go ahead.
Well, maybe that's the answer to my question. Segues into the business revenues brought in. And am I hearing that if they don't have a say in electoral politics as much as they did, do they leave and not provide revenues? There has to be some basic glaring fact that shows a reason for the downturn in the revenues.
Dennis,
and I have lots of family out there, and we've had a beautiful
I just think
state.
that there's here's the way they say it to me, and again, this went way negative. I don't know if this is the Arizona bash session or whatever this was. It just keeps going way negative. Think about this. Here's literally the context in which this was said to me. He said, Dennis, we used to plan. We used to make decisions for the long run. We'd plan for growth. We'd build freeways. We'd put energy plants in place. We were socially engaged. Now folks don't ask our opinion. They don't care anymore. We're less engaged with the legislature. They don't ask our opinions. So will they leave? No, I mean, many of these are population-serving industries, utilities or retail or that kind of thing that have flourished from the folks there. They're not likely to leave, but they're just not prospering the way they have in the past. And Arizona is obviously is not growing as they have in the past.
Andres, did you have your hand up back there?
Yes, hi. I'm Andres Martinez. I run the Fellows Program here at New America. I had a question, and I guess this is mainly for Mary Jo. In the earlier panel, we heard Gregory Rodriguez talk about how politics around immigration and identity changed drastically in California when you had a generation of Latino leaders emerge in Sacramento, and you had the first assembly speaker in California be Latino in the late 90s, et cetera. And we also heard earlier from Supervisor Valadez in Pima County talking about how 2 out of 5 supervisors in that county are now Latino. But I don't have a sense of, at the statewide level, when you look at the sort of leadership ranks, in the legislature, is there a generation of Latino leaders that is emerging, that is about to kind of come to the fore, that might alter the dynamics of these debates in Arizona the way we've seen it happen in California?
Possibly, but as Gregory was talking, I was sort of mentally going through the ranks of the Arizona legislature now, and those in leadership, there's like one Latino that's in a leadership position, and she's in the minority party in the Senate. When I look at who's probably going to be in leadership after the elections, like the Democratic lineup in the House of Representatives, I think the people that are lining up, I don't see one Latino in there. So if it's out there, there might be a couple of folks who are getting elected this fall, who are becoming in as freshmen. That remains to be seen. It's a long, hard slog when you're a minority Democrat in Arizona to rise up. And interestingly, to go to Dennis's point about everything being so negative, I mean, I will note that in the early 90s, Arizona had a Hispanic Senate president, Pete Rios, who has now moved on to county government, is one of 3 supervisors in the very used to be growing county of Pinal County. But I'm not seeing that big groundswell yet. If they're out there, I'll be very anxious to see what happens with in terms of voter turnout in next month's election among the Hispanic population.
That is shocking, actually. I think we're done. Is there any? I guess we could take one other quick question if somebody has one, because I know there were a few hands.
Just a quick one. My name's Ed Newton. I'm a writer, and I thought you're talking about the politics of money. That nobody mentioned the Citizens United decision. I was wondering, has there been any sort of infusion of money into Arizona, not dimly identified money that's not that's going in one direction or another?
I know there has. Have you followed it specifically?
Yeah, not so much on the congressional level. I haven't, so I can't really. You can probably speak to that better than I can.
I've seen the printout of ads recently in all the areas. I don't have it committed to me. It was virtually every ad in the country, but in Arizona, as in other states, when you look at the printouts, it says, Democratic ad, Republican ad, and then it's like 10 straight ads from organizations you've never heard of. So it's definitely in Arizona.
Yeah, but we've got some contested congressional races.
Or are things so solidified in Arizona that need that?
Oh, I mean, I think especially on the congressional level, it can have a big effect. We have 3 seats currently held by Democrats that are very much on the bubble, and that's where a lot of that money is going. On the state level, we've got money. This is how the business interests that perhaps are not able to speak to candidates who are using public financing, they can make their voices known through independent expenditures. It's how Arizona's interpreted the Citizens United. So you have a lot of business groups that are putting money either into campaigns, either supporting a candidate or, sort of more importantly, opposing another candidate.
I think that's it for this panel. And I think you're going to do concluding. Somebody doing concluding remarks? Wow, that's a big responsibility. Thank you all for sticking it out to this point. I think it was a terrific group of panelists who know a lot about government and politics. Thanks to them, all of you, and thanks to all of you.